happy to present World War One from an Australian perspective. With an Egyptian twist, with there being an Egyptian monument being built in Australia as a result of World War One. I will cover Gallipoli as well as a surprising family connection.
Hello again, everybody. Thanks for joining me again. Everybody's journey is different, and my Egyptian fixation started as a child when I was quite ill with whooping cough. I was a couple of months away from school and there was nothing to do but sit and watch television. And I remember those moments at my grandmother's watching the ABC, which is Australia's national broadcaster, and a program called For Schools. And one of the programs on that was about ancient artifacts, ancient civilizations, indeed Egyptian ones. No group has affected our society more than Egyptian culture. They have ingrained in almost every area of our life, whether it be mathematics, agriculture even, anything you care to think of. In Albert Pike's book, written in the 1880s, Morals and Dogma, he raises the possibility that dead people rule the earth. And that is in fact true. When we look at the way our society works, it is in fact dead people who rule the earth. I've left a link to this book in my description. It is a very difficult read, but if you're interested in Freemasonry and things of that nature, it's worth a read. But if you really want to know how the world works, Machiavelli is the one to go to. In his book, The Prince, which was effectively a job application, one he failed on, he outlines the ways that people should be ruled and controlled and made think in certain ways. He was the forerunner to Goebbels and such people, and politicians around the world use this as a sort of Bible. Now, I think we should start our story with World War I, then known as the Great War. World War I has affected more things in modern times than anything else. Now, you might say it's 100 years old, so how could that be modern times? In fact, it is. Several monarchies throughout Europe lost their thrones. It opened up Egypt in faraway places, and indeed most of the major discoveries in Egypt were made after World War I.
World War I, or the Great War as it was then known, started off with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, who was the nephew of Wilhelm of Austria, by a Serbian independence movement who had the support of Russia and the Allies. But the truth of this is that Germany and Austria had had a military build-up for years, upgrading their navy to rival that of England, and there was much resentment, and the assassination was an excuse to put all their new weapons to a test and see how they worked, and each had an idea of gaining world dominance. On a recent trip to France, I visited a number of Great War burial sites. The whole country is scattered with them, and a highly emotion-charged visit it was.
It's hard not to get emotional in places like these. You see, just one, many war cemeteries in France. This one happens to be in arrears, and it is decorated by members of the Great War. It is very difficult to see what is great about it, but that was the name that it was then known by. Now, of course, we speak of it as World War I, and I have to admit that my eyes are wet, and feel I'm on high ground.
Even today, it is still possible to see bullet holes in some of the buildings in France. I don't know whether these are from World War I or from World War II, but bullet holes they are, in a nearby building to where I was staying. Alliances were soon formed, and lines of both resistance and attack soon drawn, with a trench going almost the entire length of Europe. And trench warfare was something new in the world, and absolutely abhorred, and nobody, nowhere could break the trenches. And what made things worse was the use of gas, something that had never before been used in war. It was hell on earth for those who were participating, and later for the families of the returned servicemen. And another new condition was learnt about, the condition of shell shock, which affected people for a generation, and it wasn't truly understood until the Vietnam War. In the Great War, after Great Britain declared war on Germany, the Australian Prime Minister Joseph followed suit, with absolutely no opposition from the opposition leader Andrew Fisher. Practically the only time in Australian politics government and opposition agree is for a war. The Australian population at the time was under 5 million people, yet Australia managed to send 416,000 troops, 38.7% of the male population, to Europe, West Africa, all over the world. And the cost of this was terrible. 60,000 Australians were killed in the campaign, and 156,000 were wounded. Coo-wee! Was the cry, which started a march in Gilgandra. The month-long march covered 515 kilometres, and 263 recruits headed to Sydney. The almost brand new nation of Australia, being a mere 13 years old, was ready for a fight, and it was going to be over and done within a couple of weeks. Gee, did they get that wrong. The word Cooey I should explain. It comes from the Danga Aboriginal dialect, and it is a word to call people over a distance. A great crowd of people gathered in Sydney to see the yet-to-be-named Anzacs. The men, and some of them boys, it wasn't uncommon for them to mark up their age so they could join the campaign, climbed aboard the ships to go to new and strange parts of the world. And in a cruel fate, some of the world's grand ocean liners were converted to mere troop carriers, the Olympic, the sister ship to Titanic, being one of those. The boilers were stoked, the gangways were raised, and they began their journey to hell, Gallipoli. The then Lord of the Admiralty thought it wise to start a second front. With Turkey being an ally to Germany, that was the place chosen. It is speculated that the wrong beach was landed on, but it was a sheer mess, and the Australian troops surprisingly found themselves under the total control of the British command. What a mistake. And in later years, Winston Churchill made a speech about fighting them on the beaches. I could imagine the knots in their guts as they heard that speech after the mess in Gallipoli.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
The landing at Gallipoli took place the 25th of April 1915 with Australian and New Zealanders, the beginning of the Anzac Alliance, along with the French and the British, landing under heavy fire. The Royal Navy moved in as close to shore as they would dare to stem the bloodshed. It is said that less than half of those in the first wave made it ashore alive. A difference of 3 feet in the height of the beach was responsible for saving many lives. However, what sort of a fool would give your opponent the upper ground by choice? After the landing, the bodies piled up, and the British High Command was said to be drinking sherry in their warships outside the range of the Turkish heavy artillery. At one point in the campaign, an armistice was arranged for burying the putrid bodies of both the Turks and the Allies. Things were so ridiculous that the free-flowing Australians and New Zealanders who were giving them curry in the Turkish trenches were ordered back because their advance was too fast. What a difference it would have made if they had been allowed to continue. By who, I don't know, but an ingenious weapon was devised so that people didn't have to raise their heads and get them shot off in the trenches. Well, you know you're in Australia when you can hear cicadas. Sorry, I can't do much about that. As you can gather, things were pretty shitty in Gallipoli, but there was a saving grace. Keith Murdoch, later to become Sir Keith Murdoch, and father of the media baron Rupert Murdoch. Some people say it's a pity he had any children at all. Started to write letters, and the British High Command did their best to block those letters because they were having a political effect on the war. They've always wanted war to look better than it is to the general public. I will share with you one of his letters.
High Commissioner's Office, London, September 23, 1915. Personal. Dear Mr. Fisher, I shall talk as if you were by my side, as in the good days. I write of the unfortunate Dardanelles expedition, in light of what knowledge I could gain on the spot on the lines of communication and in Egypt. It is undoubtedly one of the most terrible chapters in our history. Your fears have been justified. I visited most parts of Anzac and Savalapi with the leaders, and what senior and junior officers I could reach, and was favoured in all parts. With full and frank confidence, our men were I found immensely proud of their little progress on the plateau on our right Lone Pine Plateau. But I found that we had paid 2,500 men for this advance on a short front of 300 yards. Winter is on us and it brings grave dangers. Perhaps the most vital danger from weather is that before the rain comes to end all our water troubles, there will be a spell of bad weather at sea that will prevent us from getting water ashore. Already the flies are spreading dysentery to an alarming extent, and the sick rate would astonish you. It cannot be less than 600 a day. We must be evacuating 1,000 sick and wounded men every day. When the autumn rains come and unbury our dead, sickness must increase. Even now the stench in many of our trenches is sickening. Alas, the good human stuff that lies there buried, the brave hearts. Still the sorrow in our hard-hit Australian households. The spirit of Suvia is simply deplorable. The men have no confidence in London. Every man knows that the last operations were grossly bungled by the General Staff, and Hamilton has led a series of armies into a series of cul-de-sacs. Men living in trenches with no movement except when they are digging, and with nothing to look at except a narrow strip of sky in the blank walls of their prison, cannot remain cheerful or even thoughtful. Much more I could tell you, but my task is done, though I shall write again. Next mail, I hope with better news. This, of course, is a private letter, but you will show it to George Pearce and Hughes, so I shall say nothing more than the plain goodbye of a friend. Sincerely yours.
Some have said that the only good thing about Gallipoli was the way we left there. A smart group of blokes designed something called a drip gun, whereby the Allies could leave the beach without the Turks knowing. And from what I can gather, these guns were surprisingly effective. They actually managed to kill a few Turks. There has of course also been speculation that the Turks knew that they were leaving and they were happy to get rid of them. Turkey today is a very different place, with Gallipoli Beach being visited by many tourists, and indeed a monument has been erected to the battle that was. However, after Gallipoli, the war was not over for the Australians. Many of them were redeployed around the world, but in the interest of our video, we're going to talk about the deployment to Egypt. The peaceful waters of the Nile are the reason for Egypt's very existence. Turning a great pile of sand green in the Nile Delta allows agriculture and allows a society to evolve which has changed the world. In the shadows of the pyramids, there have been many armies, starting with the Egyptian armies themselves, then the Greeks, the Romans, Napoleon too, whose armies took pot shots at the pyramids and Sphinx. However, we do owe him a thanks for the Rosetta Stone. One thing that all the armies have in common is that they loot, they take, they rob from Egypt, making the mystery of Egypt even harder to solve, as it must be solved from the missing pieces. So now it's the turn of Australians to find themselves both in a war and both in the shadow of the pyramids. And I could imagine that this would be highly inspiring. You can see some soldiers on horseback riding into Cairo, hopefully not going to get some cheap souvenirs. In another war, not too far away from the First World War, was the Second World War, and the Australian battalion based in Egypt was accused of the theft of the penis of Tutankhamun. However, it is a little bit hard to explain how this one turned up. Oh my goodness, I tell you what, the Egyptians like to build things on a large scale. But let's explore the story of an Australian serviceman who was inspired to build an Egyptian monument in Australia. I must firstly apologise for the graininess of the photo of Private William Thomas Shirley from the 13th Battalion. Photos from World War I are hard to come by. No doubt he saw the way the Egyptians honoured their dead and felt the same about his mates he lost in the war. So that is why he tried to copy an Egyptian monument, even including some Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Sphinx Memorial Park is located 26 kilometres from the Sydney CBD. Kangiangi Chase National Park near Sydney is this monument, one that is not in any way in dispute, as are the hieroglyphs. This one was built by William Shirley, who served in North Africa in World War I to commemorate his lost mates. The construction project was quite arduous. It took him from 1926 until 1928 to complete the work, and he died in August 1929, with the site being refurbished in the 1990s. The monument is 1/80th the size of the original Sphinx in Egypt, with two symmetrical pyramids both left and right, and an altar out front featuring Egyptian hieroglyphs. Also, a flagpole has been placed left and right, with sheds underneath for the purpose of storage. Over time, the monument has been added to with a tribute to the HMAS Adelaide, after serving the Royal Navy well, was broken down for scrap. I am always sad to hear of the death of a ship. The great vessel that saw action in World War II mast sits in front of the Sphinx Memorial, along with the plaque previously shown. Hovering above the great man, William Shirley's work, you could almost be in Egypt, until you ascend and see the Australian gum trees. There is also a walking trail called the Sphinx Walk. If you choose to visit, you should also explore, if you're fit enough to do so. While walking around, we saw a scrub turkey, and to those inclined and not in a national park, they are absolutely delicious. One of the extra activities to do when visiting the Sphinx Memorial Site is the Sphinx walking track. Without following the track all the way down, we finish up in one of the tributaries of the Hawkesbury River. Eventually, if we followed that, we'd finish up at Patonga or somewhere. As I was driving along to the West Head Lookout, I thought that things were pretty much wrapped up, but I got a big surprise. The West Head Lookout is in the Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park and is 33.8 kilometres from the Sphinx Memorial. Once you arrive at the lookout, you have excellent views of Pittwater and Barrenjoey Lighthouse, as well as Lime Island. Then I made my discovery. After doing the West Head Army Track, I remembered one of the stories that my step-grandfather had told me. My step-grandfather's name was Bernie Ryan, and he always had a good story, but this one relates very strongly to historical events. Best I give you a background on the people and then the historical event, and then show you the gun emplacements. We are presently en route to Belmont Cemetery, to the graves of my late grandfather, his mother and father, with his father being Private William Ryan, better known as Bill, and his mother being Margaret Ryan, formerly Margaret Friel. William was born the 17th of March 1892 in Ipswich, Queensland, and was first married in 1915 in West Maitland. However, the marriage did not last. His second marriage to Margaret took place in 1928, and she survived him, dying the 18th of July 1960. He himself died on August the 14th, 1959. It's surprising what research uncovers. All these events happened before I was born, and some of the people I never met. I did know that William Ryan had a drinking problem, and I did know that he went to war. But there was a large number of surprises that come about when I looked at his war record. Me and my grandfather had so many good times. He couldn't have been a better man if he had have been my real grandfather, but I always looked upon him as if he was. Sadly, we lost him in 2006. His mother Margaret I never met. She was long dead before I was born, and it wasn't possible to find any photographs of her. Likewise, his father too. However, a photograph was possible because of his war service. All three of them lie in a Commonwealth war grave. William served in France in World War I. While in France, he inhaled some mustard gas. Not enough to kill, but enough to cause health problems. The Department of Veteran Affairs didn't want to know about his health problems. It wasn't until after he died and an autopsy was performed that it was found that his lungs were eaten out. The peaceful shores of Blacknet's Bay in Swansea.
Somewhere on Blackned's Bay, I'm not sure, propped up against a tree, William Ryan was counting his money. And sadly he passed, which proves you can still have money and be dead broke.
William Ryan enlisted with B Company 35th Battalion AIF on the 8th of January 1916 and was an original member of the battalion and left Sydney on board HMAT A24 Benalla on the 1st of May 1916 and disembarked at Plymouth, England on the 9th June 1916, where the battalion spent the next 4 months in training. It crossed into France in late November and moved into the trenches of the Western Front for the first time on the 26th of November, just in time for the onset of the terrible winter of 1916-17. The battalion had to wait until the emphasis of British and Dominion operations switched to the Ypres section of Belgium in mid-1917 to take part in its first major battle. This was the Battle of Messines, launched on the 7th of June. The 35th's next major battle was around Passchendaele on the 12th of October. Heavy rain, though, had deluged the battlefield, and thick mud tugged at the advancing troops and fouled their weapons. The battle was a disaster for the 35th. 508 men crossed the start line, but only 90 remained unwounded at the end. For the next 5 months, the 35th alternated between periods of rest, training, labouring and service in the line. When the German army launched its last great offensive in the spring of 1918, the battalion was part of the force deployed to defend the approach to Amiens around Villers-Bretonneux. It took part in a counter-attack at Hangard Wood on the 30th of March and helped to defeat a major drive on Villers-Bretonneux on the 4th of April. The desperate nature of the fighting at this time is revealed by the fact that the 35th Battalion suffered nearly 70% casualties during these operations. 7th of June 1917.
The story I'm about to tell has two possible dates. Friday the 29th of May 1942 or Monday the 8th of June 1942. Both of those dates coincide with submarine attacks, the first one on Sydney and the second one on Newcastle respectively. My memory can only remember a submarine attack, and sadly I cannot ask my grandfather for the date. William Ryan, now 50, was crewing a Hawkesbury River patrol boat that were made of timber and made by the famed boat builder Halverson. Despite his ever-increasing health issues and lack of support from Veterans Affairs, he was still doing his bit, and as a good father, he wanted to take his son on an adventure. 12-year-old Bernard, my grandfather, was with him. However, his choice of dates were terrible. They were out in the boat at night and word come of the attack. Not knowing the size of the opposing force and thinking they were going to see some action, William put his son ashore in a safe place. In a bunker in a gun emplacement on the Hawkesbury River overlooking Pittwater. Until my trip there I had never seen it, but I spotted it, and later in the video I'll show it to you. I can imagine a frightened young man hiding out in a bunker and a valiant man in little more than an oversized rowboat armed with nothing more than a 303 taking on the might of the Japanese Imperial Navy. That guy had guts. I will leave links in the description giving details of both submarine attacks. They had good reason to run patrols in the Hawkesbury River as there were many battleships tied up there. I was lucky enough to find a model of the gun emplacements as they once were, which featured a railway for resupply. I could not find any traces of the railway when I explored them. The gun emplacements as viewed from the Hawkesbury River. The climb down is incredibly steep, and a word of warning, if you are not fit, don't attempt it. Concrete cancer is taking its toll on the gun emplacements, as can be seen from this image. Maybe some conservation measures should be attended. The view is extraordinary, and it's quite logical as to why a gun emplacement would be placed in this position. As you move down, you reach an observation post which is now closed to the public, and in the distance you can see a gun emplacement which is now overgrown. The view inside of the gun emplacement reveals various openings and crevices, and it is even possible to see where the gun once was. Well, this looks like an interesting place to explore. Not even sure where it goes. A bit overgrown though. Nonetheless, we'll have a look. It's strange how the memory works. Amongst all the graffiti and years of neglect, when I walked inside that bunker / ammunition storage, I realised that that was the very bunker that my granddad had hidden out in all those years ago. And I tell you, I got cold shivers on the spot. As if done by a ghost, there was even graffiti there that said, "G'day." For those not in Australia, that's an Australian greeting. Just a short walk to the final gun emplacement, and the view is simply amazing. The interior looks no different to that of the previous one.